What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning. So first things first, the name of this game is really dumb. Pretending this remaster got a decent name, we'll continue on with the rest of the review. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, originally released in 2012, there was a ton of drama around its release and the studio involved in creating it. This review isn't really going to go over those things, mostly because it's fairly common knowledge these days, but basically THQ Nordic bought up the rights a few years ago and was able to release a remaster which kind of updated the graphics, and that's about it, and that is Re-Reckoning. Now supposedly there's supposed to be a new Fatesworn DLC on the way at some point, which is still being worked on but has yet to materialize, so we'll see what happens there. Now I personally never played Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, so this game was the first foray into it. There is an argument to be made that the remaster itself offers basically nothing to the people who have already played and enjoyed the game, and that is a sentiment that I agree with, which is why I want to mention that at the start of this review. Moreover, I review games after 100% because I feel like it sets me apart from other YouTubers for the most part. There is a link to my Steam profile down in the description, as well as on my YouTube channel, and if you're curious what a review after 100% entails, there's a video on my channel about that as well. If you're not subscribed to my channel, it'll be the first video you see when you click on my channel page. With that out of the way, let's actually jump into it. First things first, let's talk about difficulty. So when you fire up a new game, you're going to pick a difficulty. The main thing to understand here is that what this actually does is scale the enemy levels pretty much in comparison to your levels. Now the entire game world is somewhat level bound, meaning that enemies within this area will be a certain level. However, the difficulty kind of adjusts that in comparison to the level you would be at that time, meaning that if you do most of the quests, you'll be like this level in this area. And the difficulty adjusts the enemy levels kind of based on that. So easy, they're going to be way below you. On normal, they're either going to be about one level above you or pretty much right where you are. On hard, enemies will be consistently leveled up above you. And on very hard, they will be significantly higher level than you, and of course all of this means increased or reduced damage, though truth be told, simply because of the way the game is set up and the fact that there's a reckoning mode in combat, playing on higher difficulties isn't that big a deal. It just really determines how quickly you die if you get like stun locked in combat or something. Now, character creation itself is fairly straightforward. There are 4 races to choose from that truthfully are a little too similar for my personal liking. They are the Almain, the Varani, the Lajolsafar or something, and the Dakolfar. Basically, these are various types of humans and elves, and depending on which one you pick, you will get a racial bonus to your skills. Skills, truth be told, aren't that super important, so pick whichever one you like. It's not going to make too big of a deal. And then after this, you're going to be able to pick a god that your character then worships, either the god of wisdom, love, death, fate, mischief, or no god at all. Each one of these will give you a bonus towards a certain playstyle. So the best thing to do here is pick one of these that coincides with the way you want to play your character. While you won't actually pick them during character creation, I do want to talk about the skills a little bit, since the character creation gives you racial bonuses to skills, but then completely fails to explain what they are, outside of something that might be exceedingly obvious, but because, you know, stealth is pretty much stealth, right? Now, in terms of skills, there are alchemy, blacksmithing, detect hidden, dispelling, lockpicking, mercantile persuasion, sagecraft, and stealth. Most of these are self-explanatory. Most of them have a point at which putting more points into them is pointless. For instance, lockpicking, you can go through the game with like 1 point in lockpicking and be just fine, just because of the way the lockpicking system works. Basically Skyrim's lockpicking system. And as such, as long as you got enough lockpicks, you really don't need to put points into lockpicking. Dispelling allows you to remove magical wards. It is a sort of alternative to lockpicking. Having a few points in that helps, but you don't need a ton by any means. Alchemy, I like to put at least 5 points in. This allows you to consistently harvest materials out in the world and make the best potions. Specifically, one kind of potion, a fate potion, but we'll talk about that later. Mercantile gives you better prices, but honestly, you're going to have so much gold by the end of the game that that's basically pointless. Persuasion sounds fun, but there aren't really any choices to be made. Persuasion usually just gives you a better reward or makes you skip tedious quest steps. Stealth is awesome, but unless you're playing a stealth character, kind of meaningless. So because of that, all of these skills, while there are ones you want certain amounts in, the most important, I would say, is probably detect hidden, as it will give you extra loot, extra passages by showing you hidden doors and things, showing you enemies on your minimap. And again, as such, detect hidden is basically the best one, though others do have their uses. Blacksmithing and sagecraft will help you create items, and then using sagecraft, you can socket those items. That is basically like a jewel crafting thing almost. Moreover, when you're out in the world, there are actually trainers for each skill that you can find who will, once per level, be able to increase the skills you have, in addition to you getting 1 skill point per level to increase these. So between skill trainers and the points when you level up, you'll basically have more than enough to get everything you need on the skill page, and I really just wouldn't worry about it. Now from here, the game jumps into a tutorial after you yourself come back from the dead, and we'll talk about that a little more here in just a second. I want to talk about the tutorial first. So the tutorial literally just goes over the basics. As tutorials go, this game has a pretty solid tutorial. It goes over the basics of combat, the basic styles of combat. Do you want to use stealth and daggers? You can use a bow. Do you want to go melee and shield? Do you want to be a mage or a sorcerer and cast spells and use magical weapons to deal elemental damage? The tutorial is pretty solid at showing what the game can actually do for you. And in terms of combat styles, that basically comes down to 3 different types of abilities. And those are sorcery, finesse, and might. Now these are essentially skill trees. You're going to get about 3 points to spend on all of them across the board every time you level up. So you're going to get 3 points per level up to put into either sorcery, finesse, or might. And this will kind of determine your play style as well as the equipment you can wear, as equipment you find in the world will have requirements of these attributes to use, usually only one of them. But you'll find armor that has a certain finesse requirement, a certain sorcery requirement, or a certain might requirement in order to be worn. And the game does actually allow a certain amount of mix and matching here, and it kind of expects you to do that, because the other thing I want to talk about in terms of building your character is your destiny. Basically, as you continue the story just a little bit farther, you'll run into a fate weaver who can show you your destiny, if you will. Once you have a certain amount of points in any of the 3 trees we just talked about, you can unlock certain destinies for them, which will then give you passive bonuses and things to the damage and things you do of that type. So there are sorcery destinies, might destinies, finesse destinies, as well as mix and matching them. And you can just freely swap between the destinies you have unlocked at any time, and it'll give you a combat bonus depending on which destiny you have. So sorcery and finesse destinies will kind of have a combination of finesse abilities and sorcery abilities, and it'll kind of give you bonuses to each of those things. Or if you go pure sorcery, you'll get a ton of bonuses to just that one thing. Character building and kind of the tutorial and stuff out of the way, let's talk about the story setups. What actually is the story of this game before we jump into the rest of it? Well, basically, there are Fae and the mortal races. The Fae can be killed temporarily, however, after a time, they will eventually come back to life, so they're immortal. But for the most part, they coexist with the mortal races just fine, until a group of Fae called the Tuatha rises up and takes over one of the houses of Fae, as they are divided up into separate kinds of Fae, usually into houses. But the Tuatha take control of the Winter Fae, as they're known, and they start warring with the mortal races. This war goes on for a couple decades before the game starts, and the Tuatha are winning under the leadership of a man named Gadflow, who seems to be, for all intents and purposes, quite different from other Fae. And as time goes on, mortal races are slowly losing this battle of attrition simply because when they die, they're dead, and the Fae keep coming back. So as such, the mortal races are looking for a way around this. And it seems they're doing a lot of research into souls and necromancy and things, and trying to basically bring people back to life in an attempt to turn the tide here, which goes completely unsuccessful until you come along, because the game starts with you being carted off as a dead body, everyone thinking you're another failed experiment, but then, magically, you come back to life and you become the Fateless One. The game itself has a lot of concepts of predestination, which is that like everything you do has already been pre-decided, so to speak, but you, as the Fateless One, aren't tied to any of this because they brought you back from death. And this manifests itself in your ability to shift the fate of others, meaning that basically you can change the future, whereas everyone else is kind of predestined to be this one thing only. And of course, the story follows us trying to find out, how we died, how we can oppose Gadflow, what our position as the Fateless One means. And while I'm not going to go into it a ton, the story itself is fun for the most part. It's very linear, not a lot of choices to be made or anything like that, but the story itself is decent. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about world building. Now you're kind of dumped into the world after the tutorial, and it's a big open world, so you're kind of free to explore and do what you will for the most part. However, of course, you are given the main quest to track down and follow. And then there's also a ton of side quests and things that you can track down, which is the bulk of the game, of course. But let's talk about the world building. The actual lore and things that are happening in the background between all the Fae, the factions and stuff, for the most part, it's pretty good. The biggest detractor for the world building, though, is that the actual exploration part of it is pretty barren. There's really not much to find. In fact, really the only thing you're going to find by exploring the world are these things called lore stones. And if you find all of them, or all of a set, I should say, you'll get a small bonus. And that bonus can be like resistance to a certain damage type. It can be a percentage increase to your mana or health or your experience gain. Just little bonuses like that for finding all of the lore stones in a set. And there's just shy of 200 of them total. But outside of that, there's really not much to be had from exploration, because basically what happens is you'll go to towns and things, you'll get side quests, etc., and all of those quests are going to send you to little inside dungeon areas are where the quests actually take place. The actual open world has very little to offer outside of the actual towns. That said, the towns themselves are pretty cool. I enjoyed them quite a bit. Now, the map is divided up into several biomes, so to speak. So you kind of start off in a forest, and then there's like a desert biome in a different area, and then later in the game you kind of come up on a swamp. And you can fast travel around the map as much as you please, which is pretty nice. As long as you're not in an inside area, you can just fast travel to anywhere you've already been, which is pretty handy. But the towns themselves, inside all of these different biomes, are probably the best part of the game. There's a lot to do. This is usually, of course, where you pick up all your quests, where you can do all your crafting, sell things. You can also pickpocket people, you can steal stuff. There's just more going on in town. And unfortunately, that just kind of leaves the actual open world a little underwhelming, frankly. Now, another big thing, also while you're in town, there are a few different player houses that you can find and upgrade. These are especially handy because they give you access to a stash, which lets you throw unneeded items into your stash, and then you can come get them whenever, basically, which is a pretty great little feature. And then outside of all of that, there are the faction quests. The factions are divided up into the Warsworn, the Scolus Arcana, the Travelers, as well as the House of Ballads. There is technically one more, but it's kind of involved in the main plot towards the end, so it's kind of whatever. But basically, each of these represents the standard fighters, thieves, and mages guilds from other games. Now, the quest lines for each of these guilds are actually pretty fun. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Some of the best side quests in the game are definitely for these factions, and each of them are pretty interesting. Now, the Warsworn are basically your fighter mercenary types. They tend to hang out in big keeps, they take on mercenary contracts, and generally help keep the peace. The Scolus Arcana is, of course, your mages guild. They're all about discovering arcane knowledge, teaching people to be mages, pretty standard stuff there. Their quest was probably the most interesting to me personally. And then you have the Travelers. They like to hang out in these little kind of gypsy caravan type camps. They are your thieves. They actually are the places you would go to access a fence to sell all of your stolen items, should you find any. You know, just lying on the ground, of course. And then there's the House of Ballads. This is like almost a bard's guild. It's real weird. It's probably the most unique of all the factions, but it's real hard to narrow down and talk about. But basically, it's a group of fae that kind of relive stories over and over again. And for whatever reason, this time, the stories are changing and you're kind of involved in that. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the best part of the game, and that is combat. Combat is the thing this game does well. It's a lot of fun. So, first of all, there's 3 different types of combat for the most part. There's Might, which is your standard melee brawler. There's Finesse, which is your more thief, agile movement sort of fighting. And then there's your best option, which is Sorcery. Comparatively speaking, Sorcery is ridiculous, and you should definitely go Sorcerer. I used Sorcerer for the harder playthroughs towards the end, and it was a joke. Things can't even get close to you when you're a Sorcerer, and towards the end, you're recovering so much mana, you basically can just cast spells endlessly, and it's not even a competition. Sorcery is the best way to go if you're just looking to play the game as effectively as possible. The melee options are fun. Finesse actually get an option to assassinate unaware targets, which is a lot of fun. There's also a Reckoning mode. Basically, as you fill up your fate meter, as they call it, by performing special attacks and combos and things in combat, you can then activate a Reckoning mode, which is a very visually cool combat style that allows you to deal probably about 3 or 4 times as much damage as normal. And then once everyone is down, you can activate a special attack that will then have this very cinematic killing of an enemy, that during which you can mash a quick time event, which will give you increased experience for all of the enemies you killed during your Reckoning mode. Now, this is where I want to talk about that Fate Potion from earlier. Throughout the game, you can get a recipe for a Fate Potion, because enemies you kill in Reckoning mode have a chance of dropping this thing called Essence of Fate. And you can use Essence of Fate to make Fate Potions. Fate Potions instantly fill your meter, allowing you to do this immediately. Meaning that if you're doing this consistently and constantly making those potions through having 5 points in alchemy, you can be in Reckoning mode more often than you're not. And Reckoning mode by itself, because of all the increased damage and slowing down time, is basically an I win button as it is, but combined with those potions means you're basically unkillable. Now, while combat is a lot of fun, it does have its weak points. Truthfully, I think the dodge and the block system is a little wonky. So when you dodge something, there is no iframe on a dodge. So you can be hit while you're dodging and still take damage, which is honestly pretty frustrating in a lot of ways, because it's like I feel like I did the right thing and then I'm still getting punished for it. And then with the attack patterns of enemies when you're getting swarmed, it's very possible to just get into a loop where you're just consistently stunned and you die, and it's annoying. So while there can still be a little bit of refinement to this system, the combat itself is the best part of the game, and it is very fun. Now, there were 2 DLCs released for the game that are included with Re-Reckoning. These DLCs were originally put out by the game's publisher, EA, and thus were included in Re-Reckoning. These are Teeth of Neros and the Dead Kell, or Gallows End. Truthfully, both these DLCs, while stylistically pretty cool, are honestly kind of dull in the sense that they don't really add anything new to the game outside of an explorable area. All of the quests are the same, the combat's pretty much the same, there's like 1 or 2 new enemy types per DLC, but basically it's just more of the same. It's more going places, following up on all the quests. The explorable area, again, pretty dull. All the quests are going to take you to dungeons. There's not much reward for actually exploring, and outside of an occasionally cool site, there's basically no point in actually going and looking at any of this stuff, or at least there's not any incentive to do so, which makes them feel a little empty. That said, the stories themselves of the DLC are pretty cool. I enjoyed the stories, and honestly that's what a lot of this game comes down to, is do you enjoy the story enough and the combat enough to play it? But with that out of the way, let's talk some positives, some negatives, and then draw a conclusion. Positives: combat, obviously. It's fun but unrefined. I think if they were given the chance to tighten some things up, the combat could be really spectacular. But as it stands, it's still very fun. Reckoning mode is very cool, makes you feel really powerful. And on top of that, I like the story personally. I thought the story was pretty good. And while it is pretty linear, it's nonetheless kind of interesting. There's some really big cinematic boss fights that I didn't show off here that I thought were very cool. Let's talk about negatives. Lots of useless skills, as I mentioned. So much of that skill system is just unnecessary and it's just bloated. That on top of the vastly empty world that serves no real purpose outside of, walking from one dungeon to the next outside of town. The story itself has no choices, even the side quests, where you can use persuasion, which make you think you're making a choice, but there isn't any choice. It always pretty much resolves the same way. It might just let you make things a little easier on yourself, but that's about it. There's no actual choice happening. And as a conclusion, that's really what this game comes down to, is do you enjoy the story and the combat and the world enough to play it? And while overall I do think it's a good game, unfortunately it just doesn't do anything original, it feels like. It's like I've seen all of this stuff elsewhere outside of the Reckoning mode in combat, which was pretty cool. But otherwise, it just feels like this game is copying other games as opposed to trying to be its own thing. While if you've already played Reckoning, I absolutely would not recommend buying Re-Reckoning, as there's nothing new here. And we have yet to see that Fatesworn DLC that's supposed to be coming out. If you've never played the game, then yeah, Re-Reckoning's not a bad deal if this sounds interesting to you. As it stands, it's $40 on Steam, and if what you've heard here sounds interesting, by all means, give it a shot. It's not a bad game by any means. However, what I would personally like to see is if they took the world and the lore and stuff that they've built here, made it a second game that potentially tried some new things and didn't just copy other things I've seen other places, then I think that game might be able to actually stand out and be genuinely unique. Because the combat and stuff is really fun, and if they took the time to flesh out the world more and make a new game just more interesting and more original, I think they would have a really big hit on their hands. Because, as it stands, this is fun, but albeit super mediocre in a lot of areas. So, there you go guys, there is my extended thoughts on Kingdoms of Amalur Re-Reckoning after playing through the entire game, getting all the achievements, etc. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.